You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. This week, we continue the story of David Williams. If you recall, last week in part one, David Williams was an Apache pilot who was one of the first pilots shot down in the beginning of the Iraq War. He was also captured and was a prisoner of war for 23 days in Iraq. And before we get to finishing up his story, I want to remind everybody, please make sure, if you're a fan of this podcast, that you go to iTunes and you rate and review the podcast. That's so important to us. As always, we appreciate everybody listening and passing on the word of the podcast to others, but the ratings and reviews really help us out and help get the word out there to people who may not know about the podcast. So we'd appreciate if you take the time to rate and review on iTunes or however you're listening. Rate and review the podcast so others can find out about it. Now, back to David Williams. If you last recall from last week's episode, David was shot down, and he and his co-pilot, Ronald Young, were scurrying through the desert of Iraq to try to avoid being captured, and we left off with him about to be found by the Iraqis, and it's a harrowing tale. The second half of this story, as you hear David's days in captivity and what was done to him and how things went, and, of course, his dramatic rescue. So with that, let's get to part two of David Williams on the Hazard Ground Podcast.
Now, at this point, it's quiet. All the aircraft were gone. The Iraqis had stopped shooting in the air, and the air raid sirens had stopped, and so forth. And we came up to what I refer to as like a 90-degree corner, to another road that actually ran perpendicular towards the palm trees. And that's the road I wanted to take. As we were making that 90-degree turn, Ron and I, of course, are not talking to each other. If we are, we're whispering. And I can hear Iraqis loud and clear talking.
What's your level of fear at that point?
What's that?
What's your level of fear at this point?
I'm terrified because you have different types of how do we call it, interrogations.
Right.
Okay. And the most dangerous interrogation is the combat interrogation. Usually, in a combat interrogation is when you are first captured. When you're first captured, the enemy, you have to remember, the enemy themselves are very emotional and upset. They're under duress. You possibly could compromise their position, so it may be easier just to execute you and move on with your mission. As I sit there, Ron and I lay down on this incline with our feet in the water, and I'm on my belly looking over my left shoulder, and I see three Iraqis, and they're pointing right at us. Now, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong that night. The moon at that time, the 17th of March, was a full moon. This was the 23rd of March. The moon was now at what we refer to as zenith, which means it's right over our heads. It was bright enough that we were casting our own shadows. So it was very easy for the Iraqis to see us. One of the Iraqis takes his AK, he aims our direction, and he fires, and fortunately it didn't hit us. Now, I'm not exactly sure what his intent was by doing that. Maybe he wanted to scare us. Maybe he wasn't sure it was us, or he wanted us to stand up, or whatever. But nevertheless, we stayed still. The only weapon I have on me is a pistol, which is buried underneath my ballistic protection. So it's inaccessible to me, and I only had one magazine. So I'm not going to get in a firefight with these guys who have AK-47s. My thought process was, let me get the volume of this radio down, and hopefully they will just continue on and bypass us and keep walking. As they got closer, it was evident that we were laying there, and they started yelling out in Arabic to other Iraqis. So all these Iraqis start converging to where we're at. Two of the Iraqis came down the slope, and as one of them came down, I slowly put my left hand up to plead with this guy, and I took a rifle buck stroke. He took the end of it, and he hit me right on the side of my left ear. And I mean, it rocked me. People call it blackout. I call it gray out because, my ears were ringing. And as I kind of lifted my head out the dirt, I looked at Ron, and Ron was literally face down in the dirt. And I thought they had shot him. What they had done is they hit him square on the back of the head with the rifle and knocked him unconscious momentarily.
Okay.
And as I sat there, I started to lift my head up, and they're screaming at us in Arabic. And one of them takes a knife after they bound our hands behind our back, and he takes the knife out to my throat, and I plead with him, and I said, please don't do that. Please don't do that. And he lifts me up, and he walks me up the hill with the knife under my neck. Now, you asked me, Mark, what am I thinking? Once again, I go right back to the most important people in my life, and those are my two kids. I can't let their thought go. Seeing my infant daughter and my 2-year-old son, that was my last memories that I had. And they took us to a house where they congregated, and of course, they had brought out the children. I don't know for exact, but I assume of the people that I had just engaged, the children of the two people that I had just engaged. And they were screaming at me, yelling at me, trying to make me feel guilty for what I had just done, which ultimately later on in captivity, they actually tried to put me in court and charged me for the murder of the two Iraqis.
Wow. Let me ask you real quick. So they come upon you, and they're screaming in Arabic. I mean, you can feel the anger. You can feel the hatred they have for you as they're screaming. You can't understand a word they're saying. When you start pleading with them, did you get a sense that they understood your pleas? Or did you feel like they were falling on deaf ears and you felt hopeless?
I think that when I was pleading and they felt, you have to remember, they had tied our hands behind our back. So anytime that they would swat at us with a stick or whatever, I would jerk away as to be as non-threatening as I possibly could.
Right.
Ron is very fortunate to be alive because, as I said, he's so tall. When he stood up, one of the Iraqis took his AK and literally pointed at Ron's face and fired and shot around. And, I mean, Ron had to have the muzzle blast and some of the stuff go right past his ear. How it didn't hit him is beyond me. And, I mean, that in itself scared the crap out of me. But for Ron, I can't imagine what he was thinking, how close that was, that he almost lost his life.
David, how do you collect yourself in this moment? Like, I mean, between thinking about your family, worrying about dying, general fear, and not knowing what's next, how do you collect yourself enough to be able to just get up and walk or try to do what they're saying? I mean, that seems like an awful lot going on in a short amount of time.
It is. And the way it was explained to me by one of these doctors is inside the brain you have this the subcortical portion of the brain, this reptilian portion, if you will, and it's your fight or flight mechanism. Mm-hmm. It's the part of the brain that's responsible for your heart rate, for your sex drive, the desire to eat and sustain life. And at this point, that's where you're at. You're saying, I'm going to do anything I can to survive. I've got to survive. So as they walk us back to the house, I'm non-threatening. I don't look at them. I look down at the ground. The same goes with Ron. They go through all of our possessions. And once they felt that we were not going to try anything with them, they had notified vehicles from the city of Cabana. Most of these guys that we were fighting against, Mark, they were in civilian clothes. They were not military clothes. So we didn't know, what rank they were,
right,
or anything like that,
or even what their
They're
intent
all
could
in
be.
Civilian clothes.
Yeah, I mean, so did you make any attempts to try and communicate with Ron as he's standing right next to you? Or you guys just didn't even look at each other, didn't talk to each other?
No, we didn't. Ron and I, we what they did is they put us in a room and we faced each other, but we weren't trying to say anything except ask. I don't understand what he's saying or what he's trying to tell me. There was a point where in my flight suit, in my pocket, I had what we call a blood chip, and it's a piece of paper that has multiple languages written on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, if you take this person, and it has Arabic writing on it, and it says, if you take this pilot to friendly forces, you will be rewarded monetarily with money. And I kid you not, when they took that piece of paper out, they looked at it, they just balled it up and threw it on the floor. Not a care in the world.
Wow.
And so they, once they went through all of our personal possessions, they took our watches, our wedding bands, everything that we had on us, with the exception of our flight suit and our boots. They put us in the back of a truck, like a pickup truck, and we had several guys get in the back of the truck with rifles. And at this point, I assumed they were taking us to some type of military facility.
Are you blindfolded?
Not at
Okay.
this point. No, not at this point. And as we made our way down these roads, I mean, they were driving. I don't know where they learned to drive, but it was carelessly. But they were in a hurry, and I remember making this left turn, and I was on the left side of the truck, and Ron was sitting on the right side against the cab facing me. And I looked over my left shoulder, and there must have been 50 people out in the street waiting for us.
Oh, my God.
And I knew at that point that this was going to be the angry mob, if you will. And I leaned forward in the truck as far as I could, and I remember as I was leaning forward, I looked up at Ron, and some people had grabbed the top of Ron's flight suit on his shoulders, and I remember as they yanked him over the side of the truck, I saw his two boots go up as he hit back first on the pavement.
Oh.
And it actually took uniformed guards to break up the crowd, to get them to stop kicking us and hitting us, to get us inside the building to where they could start the first series of interrogations.
Okay, so to this point, physically, how are you? I know mentally you're just like, it's a whirlwind, but physically, how are you? You shot in the foot still? You haven't eaten, you haven't slept. Kind of give me physically where you are.
My left side of my skull was in a lot of pain,
mm-hmm.
and my foot was also in a lot of pain. I didn't know the extent of the damage that I had received because the top of the boot, all I could see was that it had been blown up open. so I didn't know if I stood on my toes or what. But what they had done is now it became like a soft cell interrogation. And they actually sat us down. And I to this day, Al Jazeera was at every single interrogation that I was at.
Really?
And I guarantee, even the ones where I was blindfolded and handcuffed, they were there.
Wow.
And I saw on, if you go, National Geographic did a documentary called Inside the Iraq War. And if you watch at the 15 to 20-minute point, you actually see the very first interrogation of Ron and I.
Really?
And I never knew that existed. And I don't, to this day, I still don't know how they got it. But you could see where I'm limping. You could see the questions that they're asking us. And you could see how I have this one guy, he's got his arm around me while he's brandishing this AK-47 like I'm his trophy, you know. And they go through a very generic interrogation of what is your unit, what were you flying, what was your mission, etc. Now, fortunately, I had gone in 1996. I went through a course called the SEER Level C course.
Right.
Out at Fort Bragg.
And severe is survive, escape, what's the R and the E? Survive, evade, resist, and escape. That's what it is. Thank you.
Yeah. And it was started by a man named Colonel Nick Rowe, James Rowe, who was a Special Forces guy who spent 5 years in captivity in Vietnam. And prior to that, there was no formal training. And if you watch that video, you can see the difference in how I answer the question versus how Ron answers the questions, right? And what I was trying to do is when a question was directed towards Ron and Ron would answer it, then they redirected the question to me, and I wouldn't answer it in the same manner. In fact, I would resist and stonewall is what they quoted. And at this point, now they're trying to figure out who the senior of the two are so that they can put more of an emphasis on that person. The funniest thing in the world is to describe to the enemy what a warrant officer is. Okay?
Not many militaries have them, for those listening. I mean, warrant officers are a very American type of thing.
Yeah, they are, and they're a unique breed, and especially Army warrant officers. We're a lot different than the Navy and the Marine warrants. And they kept asking me, they said, "You are a captain." I said, "No, I'm a warrant officer," because they were looking at my ID card and they were looking for some type of reference that said captain on it. And I said, "No, I'm a warrant officer." And they said, "What is a warrant officer?" And, I wasn't going to go in this 20-minute dissertation about how the rank structure works, okay? I wanted to remove myself from this series of questioning. And I said, "Okay, yes, I'm a captain." And they said, "Yes, very good, you're a captain." And so from that point on, throughout the rest of my captivity, I was the SRO, or the senior ranking officer, known as the captain. I think that was probably the simplest thing to do to get them off my back.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, obviously, you at some point in time, and again, I'm probably speaking out of turn here, but while you're in captivity, you just want to get from point A to point B with as least resistance as possible because it makes your life a little bit easier. So after the initial interrogation, what happens next? Where do they transport you? Where do you go?
Well, The soft cell lasted till the following morning, which was the 24th, and we had some guys come down. Now, I'm still not blindfolded, and we had some guys come down from, I assume, Baghdad, and these guys were all in military uniform. They had these maroon berets. They were very well equipped. In fact, one of them had an AK-47 that was completely chrome. Even the magazine was chrome. I mean,
wow.
It was a beautiful rifle, okay? And he came down, and their attitude towards us was, or their demeanor was a lot, they were more aggravated and more irritated with us than what we had already been exposed to. And I remember one guy getting in my face screaming at me, and he was showing his palm of his hands at me, saying that the blood of his people, or somehow I caused it.
Right.
And at the time, I was wearing a name tag on my flight suit, which was the state of Texas. Okay, and we call that target by association. I had a camera there, and a guy was speaking broken English, and he looked at me, and he looked at my flag, and he says, "You are from Texas. I know this." And I looked at him, and the camera is right next to him, and he says, "Bush is from Texas."
Correct.
So I was very hesitant on how I responded. I wasn't going to incriminate myself and say, "Well, you're right, he's not a good guy." The first thing that came out of my mouth was, "I don't know him personally. He seems like a good guy to me," which ultimately ended up with a slap to the face.
Oh, wow.
After he did that, he ripped my flight tag off. He put some type of blindfold and these handcuffs. After they took my hands behind my back, the handcuffs were like a flat bar and a U, and they would use like an Allen key, and that's how they cinched down. It wasn't a regular key like U.S. law enforcement. And at this point, they separate Ron and I. I don't hear Ron anymore. They take me out and they put me in the back of a truck, and they sit me, I assume, like an SUV type SUV. And I have two guys. I have a guy on each side of me, and they rest my head, on the back of the front seat, while the guys in the back, they put their arms on my back to hold me down, to basically keep me from sitting upright.
Okay.
And the entire ride to Baghdad, the guy in the passenger seat would roll the window down, and he would yell out to the crowd that he had the American, meaning the American,
right,
and he would elbow me square right on the top of the head.
Oof.
And, of course, the crowd would applaud,
right, and
that would incite him more. So it made for a very long ride to Baghdad. Once we arrived in Baghdad, they brought me to a prison cell, and they took me into the cell. They took all my flight suit, all my boots. They actually wrapped my foot up, which was for the most part okay. It could have been a lot worse. I could have broken several metatarsal bones. Who knows? But they wrapped it up, and they treated it for burns and powder burns, etc. So they did supply some medical care for us.
Let me ask you.
Once they shut the door, that was it.
Okay, let me ask you real quick. I'm sorry. I don't mean to cut you
Go
off.
ahead.
I just kind of want to get a sense of, you're going through all this. How is your mind reacting? I mean, obviously you keep going back to thoughts of your daughter and your son, your family. But how are you doing otherwise mentally? Are you just kind of going with the flow?
No, honestly, Mark, I was terrified. I was very scared because I knew that they had reopened the case on Commander Michael Spiker,
Mm-hmm.
who had not been seen or heard from since the first Gulf War, and here it is. It's been over a decade. So I'm very uneasy and nervous because I don't know what their intentions are. I don't know if they want to use this for propaganda purposes. I don't know. Knowing how Saddam treated his prisoners historically made me very uneasy.
Were you thinking of all the ways that you could possibly die?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a natural thought, like saying, you might have just made your peace that this was going to be the end. It was just a question of how. And in certain cases, I feel like that would be the worst part because everywhere they took you, now it's like, okay, now how are they going to try to get rid of me?
It took me 4 days of sitting in that cell, and we didn't have electricity. We didn't have a bed. I slept on the floor in these pajamas, and there was no bars or windows or anything like that. The door was a solid steel door that they had a little opening, like a little 4-inch opening that they would slide open and put a flashlight down on top of you. And I suspect for 4 days or so, I thought about, man, if the Americans didn't kill us by all the ordnance that they were dropping around us, the Iraqis surely were. They did a lot of things to the physical punishment I could withstand. Okay, I expected that from them. I expected them to be angry. But what got the best of me was the psychological aspect. And I'll go into one of my hardest interrogations I did. Is they had taken me. They came in. They always had positive control. They blindfolded and handcuffed me. They took me out, and they took me. I don't know whether it was to another cell or to another room. But I remember them walking, and when I got into the room, I could hear a lot of Iraqis talking. And I could hear somebody breathing, literally standing right next to me. And then all of a sudden, I feel a rope go around my neck, and they pull it taut, and they pull it to where I'm literally on my toes, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The interrogator starts to speak to me, and and this is not Arabic at all. I don't recognize his accent, where he was from, but this was not a generic interrogation. This was, I want to know what it is in the aircraft that I see when radar searching. I want to know how to bring it down. It was very specific. Now, unfortunately, up until this point, every interrogation I had, they kept track of. They had the questions that they asked, and then they would write the responses down to those questions to see if they could catch me in a lie down the road in the future. And I was trying to fall back on all the formal training that I had done. And I said, sir, and I was being very polite. I said, sir, honestly, I'm just an instructor pilot, which is plausible. I said, all I do is I teach people how to shoot. And then I could hear him reading in a book, and he started reading it verbatim out of this book. And what it was is he had gone in my aircraft and pulled out the operator's manual. And in Chapter 4 of the operator's manual, it talks about what I see when radar searching.
Really?
It talks about what I see when there's a missile coming at me. And he had busted me in all these lies up until this point.
Wow.
And I as I sat there and I pleaded with him, I said, "Sir, I've told you everything that I possibly could. I don't know. I'm just an instructor pilot. I feel the barrel of the AK go against my head, and now I start pleading with him. I said, please, sir, don't do that." He pulls the charging handle, and he dry fires the AK against my head.
Oh, God.
And he says something in Arabic again, and once again, he pulls the charger handle back after I assume he put another magazine in, and he dry fires again. And at that time, I just broke down crying because I didn't know if that was it. Third time's the charm.
Oh, God.
All right, I don't care how tough you think you are. When you know historically how a dictator Saddam treated his people, to be in that hangman's noose and have that rifle against your temple, and he's doing mock executions, I don't know how else you would want me to respond.
I am like just my jaw's on the floor. Like I don't even know how to respond. I don't even know what to ask you next. It's just how do you recover from that?
I said, please, sir, please don't kill me. Please, I've been honest with you. He says, you are very lucky this evening. The next time, or he was referring to the next time that we met, I won't be so lucky. And they stopped the interrogation, and they took me back to my cell. And later on that night, we had 2 bombs hit close next to the building that we were in. And unfortunately, or fortunately for us, the building wasn't structurally sound. So they took us out of there. And then from that point on, they moved us every single day up until the day that I was rescued.
And these were bombs dropped by Americans, right? I mean, that's what you're referring to. Okay.
Yeah.
And so now you start bouncing around from place to place. Do you have any idea each day where you are and where you're going?
No idea, because they always had positive control. And let me remind you that I have 5 other prisoners that I have to be responsible for. If you remember Jessica Lynch's unit,
yes, the 507 Maintenance Company, yeah,
they were being held in the same facility I was in, and I was always referred to as the captain. And if I did something wrong, they would have to pay for it. So
could you get any more?
What's that?
Could they pile any more on top of you at this point in time?
I had so much on my shoulders. I will tell you this, Mark. I love those guys so much that when we were finally rescued and we were taken back to the States and launch school, and the repatriation team, which consisted of all these doctors and intelligence gatherers and everything, I was so controlling of them that I had a full-bird colonel approach me and say, "Dave, you have to let them heal on their own. You have to let us treat them." That's how that I would not let go or let them out of my sight. And to this day, they're still part of my family. I live here in El Paso. Shoshana lives not even 5 miles away. Joe Hudson also lives in El Paso. And I keep in touch with every single one of the other prisoners that I was with, in addition to the Marines who rescued us. I still am in touch with them, whether it's via Facebook or phone call or whatever it is.
So I mean, I can only imagine the bonds of captivity and what that does for you. I mean, obviously, you've explained some of it, but knowing that the only person next to you is your family at that point in time. Yes, your thoughts are with your real family, thousands of miles away, but that is your immediate family at that point in time, and being with them and sticking with them is the only thing that you have that can provide you any comfort. So I obviously I can't relate, but I can empathize with what you're saying as far as, the captivity and what it does for you. So take me to the rescue. How does it happen?
It's a very interesting story. Geographically, Ron and I didn't know where we were at. We were in the city of Samara, and from what I understand, is the city of Samara was off limits to any military action. And that was something that was agreed to between Iraq and the Allied forces because of this historical significance. We came into contact with some very humane, very intelligent Sunnis. 3 Sunnis that I'll refer to. One of them was a major, and the other 2 were captains. And one of the captains had learned English because his mother had taught English in a school. And they would sit a chair, even though we weren't free to move about, we were still confined. They would interact with us. And, I don't care what people can say, I'd love to be on a desert island by myself and be without human interaction. But if you say that, you're lying to yourself.
Sure.
Because we were desperate to be able to just talk to somebody, and especially it's very easy for Stockholm Syndrome to set in.
Right.
Very, very easy when you're confined and the only interaction and the only person that you have to talk to is the enemy. And they control every aspect of your life, whether they bring you water or whatever it is. And so here, these 3 guys, one of them we refer to, the Iraqi, as Raymond, because he was a spitting image of the character off the show Everybody Loves Raymond. I mean, he looked just like him. And so they would leave the door open. They put us all in one room, which also was a godsend because now I was able to see the wounds of the others. You got to remember, Shoshana had been shot through both her ankles. Edgar Hernandez had been shot in his right bicep, and Joe Hudson had been shot 3 times in his lower back.
Oof. And
we're going into the 3rd week, 20-some days, and their bandages are starting to look a reddish brown. It had been a while because they had been moving us. And I pleaded with the captain who spoke English. I said, please, they need medical care. And he agreed. He said, okay, we go get new stuff. Well, they went to a doctor to go get all these supplies. And the doctor became very suspicious of why he needed all this stuff. He knew that the U.S. Marines were literally outside the city limits of Samara, along just on the other side of a bridge. And what these Marines were doing is they were blocking Iraqi forces coming down from Tikrit, okay?
And let me just, David, pause you just to give everybody some geographical, kind of ideas. So Karbala, where you took your plane down in that area, we saw 60 miles southwest of Baghdad. You drive up to Baghdad, and then in the process, while they're transporting from day to day, Samara is probably about 75 to 80 miles north to northwest of Baghdad, straight up that main highway road I talked about earlier. So, I mean, you've traveled quite a distance at this point in time.
Yes, exactly. And this was all unbeknown to us. And, of course, every day after the first prison, they moved us every single day to a different prison. And so the Iraqi doctor who became suspicious went out to the Marines. He says, I don't know why, but I had somebody come and ask for all these supplies. And the only thing I could think of is that there are injured either soldiers or personnel being held here in the city of Samara. Now, this Marine unit is a small unit. It's a recon unit. It's not a large force. All it was one battalion commander, and his name was Stacy Clarity. And he had two platoons that he was overseeing. One platoon leader was Lieutenant Eubank, and the other was Captain Gordon Miller. And, of course, within that platoon, he had an Iraqi translator. And the Iraqi translator had spoke to this doctor and said, take this GPS to where you think these people are at. This is how you mark a present position, and you bring that GPS back to us. Okay? The doctor also stated to Colonel Clarity that Chemical Ali was in the city of Samara. And Colonel Clarity, he's now General Clarity, he's still in the Marines, told me that he wasn't interested. Even though Chemical Ali was a high-value target, he wasn't interested in, he had a mission he had to contend with. All right?
Mm-hmm.
So the doctor goes back to where he takes these medical supplies and realizes that the people that are being held there are the American prisoners. He goes back to the Marines and said, the American prisoners are being held in this house at this place, and this is the GPS position. And Colonel Clarity said, I need 2 volunteers right away. And both Lieutenant Eubank and Captain Gordon Miller said, we volunteered to take our platoons. They only took 2 vehicles. Their guys loaded up, and they went down into the city limits within the city of Samara, and they came straight to the house of where we were at and literally kicked the door down. There we were.
Did you have any idea that, were you just sitting there and all of a sudden a door kicks open and you see Marines, or how did you view it from where you were?
We had no idea. We were sitting in the room. We heard some military vehicle, like diesel vehicles, that we knew that were tracked, or not tracked, but we knew they were not normal vehicles. And we heard all this yelling and commotion. And then we heard this pow, pow, and finally the door kicks open. And I mean, to tell you, Mark, these Marines were every bit of the steely-eyed killer you could ask them to be. They had their M16s. They came in screaming at everybody to get down, get down, get down. And at one point, the Iraqis, and Ron jokes about it all the time, that the Iraqis got down quicker than we did. All right? And we get down, and the Marines, they get on top of us, and they're putting their knees, and they're trying to control us and hold us down because they don't know who friend and foe is.
Okay.
What they have to, their mission is they have to get everybody out of the building. Once they get everybody to a secure spot, then they can determine who is friend and who is foe.
When you were hearing English voices, were you like, oh my God, thank God?
You have no idea. The emotions that how do you control your emotions when you see this Marine staring at you and you look at him and you tell him and you say, "I'm Chief Warrant Officer Dave Williams, U.S. Army," and you can tell he's been fighting for days. He hasn't showered, and the dirt, and how do you control your emotions at that point? That now you have another opportunity to see your children one more time.
Wow, David, I just got chills.
Absolutely incredible.
I can't even imagine. I mean, God bless you. Just honestly, like I don't know what else to say. Okay, so they come through, they kick the door down, they load you up in vehicles, and you guys get out of there. I mean, is that essentially how it happens?
It was that fast. Here's the thing about Colonel Clarity. All right, he didn't ask for permission from higher up. He didn't ask his commander. He didn't. He took his own initiative, and had he not come and got us that day, Mark, I'm not confident I'd be here to even do this with you.
Wow, God. Thank God for that. I mean, there are so many people in the military who are afraid to take a piss without asking. Thank God he just had the wherewithal to come and get you. Like, honestly, for all you guys, like, it's just, and you know that from being, obviously a career guy. There are a lot of leaders who just don't like to do things without getting a blessing from a superior officer. I mean, fortunately for me, I'm not one of them. But I just, it's got to be just the most surreal moment to watch those guys come through the door, pick you up, put you in these vehicles, and take you back to an American base. Like, is that where you went right back to an American base? Right.
They put us in the back of 46s, CH-46 Marine helicopters, and they flew us to an undisclosed location. And then from that point, they took us back to Kuwait, where a team was waiting for us. And, I mean, that's how fast the news was spreading. When we were on the C-130 en route to Kuwait, they had two reporters. They had one from the Miami Herald, and they had one from the Washington Post, and they were on the plane. And that's how the information got out that we had been rescued. And once we arrived in Kuwait, the repatriation team, which they had rescued Jessica Lynch 1 week prior to that. Mm-hmm. So that now they're prepared to handle the media and how to handle us. And the first and foremost is to do the medical treatment, to make sure that we're okay. All right, and then at that point, I don't remember his name, but in the middle of the night, they moved us to a private Kuwaiti hospital, and they sectioned off an entire ward just for us. And I'll never forget this. The Prime Minister of Kuwait, when I got up in the morning to go get something to eat, in the room, this break room where we were limited to go, was this huge vase of these flowers, and there was like rose petals all over the table and everything, and there was a card from the Kuwaiti Prime Minister thanking us for our service and our contributions to the Iraqi as well as the Kuwaiti people. And I will never forget that he took the time to do that for us. And once they reoperated on Shoshana, Joe, and Edgar, and they checked me out, they flew us back to alarm stool where we started our intelligence debriefings to identify high-profile targets, etc. My thought process at the time was, it's surreal, but even though I'm being very protective of the 507, which even to this day I'm still somewhat protective of them, I want to see my kids. I want to see at the time, my wife. I wanted to see her, and I wanted to see my kids. And we spent a week at launch school. They flew us back to the States. The President and the First Lady, along with Condoleezza Rice, George Sr., and Barbara Bush were there. They greeted us when we arrived, when we came back. And, I got off the plane, I hugged my wife, and I wanted to see my babies. That's it. That's all I wanted to do. And once I was with my kids again, and I knew that I wasn't going to let them go again. Not like that, anyways.
My God bless you. God bless them. That's beautiful. I mean,
and after that, Mark, I wanted to get back in the cockpit, get back to flying and teaching, so that others would not have to go through what I went through. And to this day, I still give lectures, whether it's at universities or whatever. I still train these guys. Yesterday I flew with the cab commander, who's a full bird, and this afternoon, right before I left work, he came in to see me, to shake my hand, and just to tell me thank you for being with these, because now I have a completely different generation of pilots that we're training.
Right.
I mean, these guys are young compared to me. And I don't want to let that go. And I will continue until the day I die, ensuring that these guys have all the tools that they need when they go to combat to fight with.
David, what stays with you the most about the incident, about the whole ordeal?
Never, ever let your spirit be broken. It's kind of cliche, Mark, and it's kind of corny. But I was given this nickname called the Gray Wolf, or the Wolf. And what stays with me is, if you were to go to a zoo and you see all the animals in their habitats, they're not in their natural habitat, or they're not acting as if they would. But when you go see the wolf is pacing, and you see it in his eyes, and the wolf spirit is never broken. And going through captivity like that, going through something like that, you can never let the enemy get to you. And ultimately, towards the end, I didn't. None of us did. And I impress that upon these soldiers, if they ever find themselves in that situation, that we as Americans are always going to do everything we can to come get you. And I read in news articles quite often that organizations up in D.C. are still finding bodies in Korea, or whether in different parts of Asia. We will not rest until we bring everybody home. And that itself, I mean, we're the only country in the world that does that.
Yeah.
So I go back to saying, never let your spirit be broken. Don't live in fear, and always keep moving forward. Keep leaning forward in the saddle.
David, you're an inspiration. I mean, honestly, courage comes in many different forms, and I don't even know that there's anything I could even say that would, make people understand, what you went through. I just know that people listening are definitively touched by your story, and how courageous you were, and your heroism, and just hearing the tale about holding on to your kids again. Any parent who's listening to this obviously knows that and can relate to that. But just what you did for those 5 other people from the 507th Maintenance Company, I know that they thank you endlessly for being their leader. And Ron Young, who is your co-pilot, I know you still have a relationship with him, and you guys have strong bonds. And I just can't thank you enough for sharing your story. I am literally just floored by everything you've told me, and I wish you nothing but the best, and I hope that you continue to share this story with as many people as possible because it's worth telling.
It's been my pleasure, Mark, and anytime you have my cell phone number, reach out to me. You want to talk, I'll be here, and I'll listen.
Well, thank you again, David Williams. Again, keep teaching our young soldiers and young pilots how to survive and fight and win wars for America. But beyond that, just thank you so much for your time.
Okay, no problem, Mark. You have a good evening.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.